Well, good. Hello, everyone. Now you can hear me. Going to be talking about remnant grasslands and rare native plants. So thank you all very much for joining us. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to the Clifton Institute, then talk about remnant grasslands, then a brief mention of our native seed project, then our grassland restoration experiment, and finally some thoughts on meadow establishment. So we are a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization. We have 11 full-time staff. We're funded by individual donations and foundation grants. And our program areas are education, restoration, and research. And our mission is to inspire a deeper understanding and appreciation of nature, to study the ecology of our region, to restore habitat, and to conserve native biodiversity. And we're located in Fauquier County, Virginia, about an hour west of Washington, D.C., in the northern Piedmont. We have a 900-acre property with a wide variety of habitats, and you can check out some of the things we've been seeing lately on our iNaturalist project. And in terms of how we manage the property, we prioritize that based on trying to help declining species. We have limited resources, and that helps us do triage basically to try to help the species that need the most help. And we work to control non-native plants and establish native plants for the benefit of all biodiversity. We do a lot of environmental education. We had about 3,000 kids come through our programs last year. We do field trips as well as summer camps. And our programs are research-based, so we're out there teaching kids how to ask research questions and collect data. And one of our projects is Lawn Lab, where one of the local schools agreed to stop mowing one of their sports fields, and we're out there with the kids measuring the effects of that on plants and animals. And we also do a lot of adult programs. So we had about 1,000 adults come through our programs last year. This is a picture of a native seed collection and plant propagation workshop. And to briefly touch on our research, other than our grassland research, we've been studying American kestrels now for like 5 years, and they're a declining charismatic species that we want to figure out how landowners can help. And so we've been putting GPS transmitters on them. And we found that they select short grass for hunting, whereas their most common food item, meadow voles, are most abundant in tall grass. And so we recommend that farmers leave unmowed strips around their fields. And if you have a tall meadow, you can consider keeping a wide trail mowed through it during the summer, like at least 15 feet wide. We're also working on box turtles, and that's not as many years. We're 3 years into the box turtle work. And one of the things we want to find out is how to time mowing to avoid killing box turtles. They've declined by about three-quarters from the three long-term studies that have been done in the Mid-Atlantic. And they're really not doing well. They're still common, thankfully, but we need to act to try to slow their decline. And mowing mortality is probably a big deal for them. So far, we're finding that it's not going to be as easy as it is for grassland birds. Grassland birds are like clockwork, so that if you don't cut your hay until July 1st, you avoid killing about 80% of the grassland birds. The box turtles are using fields most in May and June, but they continue to use the fields later in the summer, so it's going to be trickier to come up with good recommendations for box turtles. We are also doing a project where we're comparing the effects of prescribed fire and deer exposures at restoring wildflowers in oak forest understories. And so our projects are very applied. Our research, we really only take a project on if it's gonna result in an answer that's useful for landowners so they can design how they manage their land. We also have a landowner outreach program, and given the topic of tonight's conversation, y'all might be interested in this. We do free property visits for landowners and also for public lands managers, and we're focused on grasslands. We have now visited 300 landowners who manage 20,000 acres in northern and central Virginia, as well as Washington, D.C. And if you're interested in getting some advice on how to manage your land, you can email Kadira Ingram, or you can go to our website. Okay, so that's Clifton. So now on to the remnant grasslands. And first, I just want to acknowledge all of these people who played a big role in the data that I'll be presenting. And especially the people with an asterisk, these are students who worked under us, Jordan Kasha, Hannah Liz, and Rachel Harrington. Yeah, so before we get started on finding out what's found in these fantastic grasslands, a little bit of terminology. So if you think of a gradient of canopy cover from 0 to 100, prairies are places that have 0 to 10% canopy cover, savannas are 10 to 25, and above that is a woodland, and finally is a closed canopy forest. And so it's important to recognize the difference of these different, recognize the definition of these different categories. And grasslands include everything from prairies up to open woodlands. And so a grassland is just a place where the cover and or the biomass is dominated by grasses and wildflowers. And so this does not exclude places with trees. And this is really important in the eastern US where we get so much rainfall. The historic grasslands would have been, a lot of them would have been savannas. There would have been widely spaced, fire-tolerant trees. And at least for the purposes of tonight's presentation, when I say meadow, I'm talking about planted grasslands, as opposed to remnant grasslands. And in school we are taught that this is the order of succession. So you have a prairie that grows up into the shrubland, that grows up into the forest. But the goal is the forest, and that's the climax community. And then if you have a big disturbance, that will reset the clock. And we would call prairies and shrublands early successional habitats. But now I want you to consider a different model, and this is thinking about old growth grasslands or mature late successional grasslands. And this is the same picture as my background. This is at the Clifton Institute in the Upper Woodcock Field. This is a field that we would call a late successional grassland. It has very high plant diversity. It has a lot of natives, not that many non-natives. And it has what you can call conservative plant species. These are species that are poor dispersers. They're long-lived, and they're not going to be found in plowed sites. And you can imagine then, if you don't do anything, then they're going to turn into forests. But if they get regular disturbance, like fire or grazing, then you can maintain these mature grasslands for a really long time, probably thousands of years. But if you remove the disturbance, you get a forest that grows up, and it's often a scrubby, short-statured forest that becomes really low in species richness. And so you're basically snuffing out all the native plant diversity when you let it grow up into a forest. But if you act soon enough by thinning some trees and burning it, you can bring it back to its high diversity state. You bring back the mature grasslands. This is using the seed bank, the seeds in the soil that can germinate, and the bud bank. This is when you have like a full sun plant that is just hanging on with a couple of leaves, just waiting for its opportunity. But unfortunately, most of the grasslands we have around nowadays in Virginia are early successional grasslands. These are places that have been plowed. They have a long history of agriculture, especially row crops. They have low species richness, not that many plant species. They have a lot of what we call ruderal plants. These are aggressive plants that are good dispersers, usually short-lived, and a lot of non-natives. And unfortunately, it seems like it's going to be really hard to bring back one of these plowed fields and have it end up looking like one of these old growth grasslands. Like it may take 500 plus years to do it. Um, People have achieved high species richness, like they planted some really diverse plantings on a really small scale. But it's hard. So, when you plow a site, you are changing the soil for a long time. You're destroying the structure and you're altering the soil microbes. And so it's not as simple as just collecting some seeds and throwing them down on, a plowed site. And how can you recognize which of these places? Well, it takes some practice to work on your plant identification. But if you see broom sedge as opposed to little blue stem, if you see beak pennant grass, tall goldenrod or one of the other rhizomatous goldenrods, common milkweed. These are indicators of an early successional grassland, as opposed to little bluestem, some of the more some of the not as common goldenrods like early goldenrod and gray goldenrod, clasping milkweed, slender bush clover, and a whole host, hundreds of other species. Now the Piedmont is this region that's found in between the Blue Ridge Mountains and the fall line, and on the east it's bounded by the coastal plain. And I know we have some folks from the Shenandoah Valley on the call tonight, and there weren't as many grasslands there, but a lot of the same themes from tonight's talk will apply to the Shenandoah Valley in terms of restoration. So what's the big deal? We've got all these grasslands in the Piedmont. They're everywhere, right? And but this is what they look like, and they are dominated by non-native, cool season pasture grasses like tall fescue and orchard grass. And tall fescue in particular is probably the most common plant in eastern North America. It covers more than 50 million acres. Um, and it's pretty good as forage for cattle, but it is really aggressive and crowds out native plants. Also, its seeds are mildly toxic to birds. So it's not good that we have so much fescue. And if you start looking around, in our neighborhood in the winter time, this is an unmowed field, and you can see this is mostly fescue. And so it's still green and photosynthesizing, even after several hard freezes. And it just flops over. And, in the snow we've just had, it gets covered up and is pretty much useless for wildlife habitat. But you'll also probably notice, at least in the Piedmont, you're going to notice, you know, in the back corner, you might see some native plants like this Indian grass. And when I started looking around my neighborhood, I went to my neighbor's property and he had all of these species growing in a hayfield, an old hayfield of his, where there was basically no fescue. It was a really nice native field that apparently had not been abused much. Um, and it had all these and many more species there. And he didn't plant any of these. Most of these you can't even find seeds of them, and they're just there. And so this got me started thinking about remnant grasslands, how long these plants have been around, and what is found in the fields in Virginia. And I went to work at the Clifton Institute, and this is an old cattle pasture where, again, it was mostly native plants, really cool diversity of wildflowers and grasses. And as I looked into it, I found that there's actually a lot of evidence that these grasslands were widespread historically in the Piedmont, at least, and also coastal plain. And this is a map from an explorer, John Lederer, from 1670. And here he's labeled a big area of the Virginia Piedmont as savanna. And this, the on the right-hand side there is the headwaters of the Rappahannock River. So it goes right up into our neighborhood of Virginia, but it goes also down into North Carolina. So when he was exploring, he found that there were still a lot of open savannas. And these places would have been maintained by fire and by grazing. And this is one study that estimates fire frequency based on fire scars and climate data. Fire scars are scars on, when you look at tree rings, you can see a scar, and if you're really lucky, that'll show you the fire history of a site. And there's not a lot, we don't have a lot of data on fire scars on the east, but based on that information and on climate modeling, they estimated that fires were really frequent in Virginia from 1650 to 1850. You can see the orange areas here are between 4 and 6 years. Every 4 to 6 years, we were having fires in Piedmont and a lot of the valley as well. And we also had bison. They were widespread in the Virginia Piedmont until around 1730. So this range map, everything to the left of the red line, shows the historical extent of bison. And they would have also played a big role in maintaining open habitats. And there's some evidence that the Native Americans were doing so many fires to try to create habitat for bison. And then we have some really hard evidence from North Carolina, and I wish we had more studies like these. We have applied for a grant to try to repeat this study like this in Northern Virginia. What they did is they took soil cores from some grasslands in the North Carolina Piedmont, and they looked at carbon isotopes, and they also did carbon dating. And they found that grasslands dominated by warm season grasses have been present in the North Carolina Piedmont for at least 2,000 years. So this shows that some of these grasslands are really old. And we think this is the case in Virginia too. We just can't prove it yet. The plant data that I'll present now to me is really compelling, but there are always going to be skeptics until we get some more studies like these. This is another modeling study that uses fire frequency and wind speed to try to predict where grasslands would have been found historically and like before the 1700s. And so every area that's brown on this map would have been a grassland, according to this paper. And I think this is a really good study. And we can see that in the northern and central Piedmont of Virginia, there would have been a lot of grasslands, according to this paper. And this is what we think they would have looked like. So this is a post-oak savanna at Fort Barfoot, also known as Fort Pickett. And they've been doing military practice, military exercises here for decades, which have led to frequent fires. And so that has resulted in this beautiful post-oak savanna with widely spaced oaks, with a lot of light hitting the ground that supports the diverse understory of wildflowers and grasses. So, I think there would have been some open grasslands, but probably not like the 1,000-acre open grassland. We would have seen, I mean, open prairie. See, I'm not even using the right terms. So we think a lot of Virginia would have looked like this. So where are all the grasslands? Well, we planted tobacco in Virginia. There was a lot that was plowed. A lot grew up into forest more recently, and that has shaded out a lot of these sites. Invasion by cool season pasture grasses and other non-natives is another problem, as well as urban development. A lot of these places are getting paved over. But so we wanted to do some research and find out what were found in the remnant grasslands in the northern and central Piedmont. We wanted to know what kinds of plants there were. We wanted to know what the conservation status was of remnant grasslands in our area. And we wanted to use our results to then design seed mixes for restoration projects and meadow plantings. So we got together with the Piedmont Discovery Center and the Restoration Ecology Lab at Virginia Tech, and we studied the plants at 132 unplanted grasslands in the northern and central Piedmont. These are mostly under power lines, and the power lines didn't create these grasslands, probably. They maintain them. So by keeping the forest down, they allow these diverse full sun grasslands to persist. And some of our sites were probably never plowed. The soils are really bad in some of these places, and they're heavy clay. You can't even put in a drain field. They don't perk. And so that is one of the reasons why we're seeing such amazing plants and animals in these remnant grasslands. We did these long, skinny 50 by 2 meter plots to sample the plants. And we've now found most of these data are coming from the Piedmont Discovery Center, but that combined with ours, we've now found around 900 plant species in these grasslands, and they are the most diverse plant communities in Virginia. They are also richer than the tall grass prairies in the Midwest. So these are exceptionally diverse grasslands. They are like on the continental scale. They are really important. And, that's about a third of the plants that are found in the entire state are found in these northern and central Piedmont grasslands. But you've probably never heard of them, or, many people have not heard of them, whereas the tallgrass prairies are so famous in the Midwest. And it's not just a bunch of weeds. It's not like, a lot of disturbances creating low quality plant communities. No, they're 86% of the plants are native. And they're also not restricted to one or two rock types that are found on a diverse set of different geologies and soils. And what do they look like? Well, this is one from Prince William County with 93 species of plants. That's really diverse. That's the richest plant community in Northern Virginia. This is found near Haymarket. This is a one from southern Fauquier County that's also really rich and has some beautiful species like grassland blazing star. This is one from Culpeper County, and it doesn't look like much here, but it's really rich with 84 species of plants. And the important thing to note of this picture, from this picture, is that it's surrounded by a scrubby forest of post oaks and blackjack oaks. And those two oaks are full sun oaks. Um, they really would rather be growing in a savanna. And so there's other stuff like Virginia pine coming up in here. And so what we really would love to do in a situation like this is to thin out about half of the trees and burn it, and then enable the rich plant community to expand to either side of the road so that it's not dependent on the roadside and on being mowed by the power company or sprayed by the power company. So the long-term solution for a lot of these remnant grasslands is to thin and burn the adjacent forests. And yes, we found a lot of rare plants. We've now found 21 threatened plants. And the plants are well known and well evaluated, and so we're pretty confident in that number. But with the insects, we really have no idea. So we've bumped into 24 or so rare insects, but their conservation status is not well known, and nobody has done any real research on insects in the Piedmont grasslands of Virginia. We'd like to do that maybe next year. But this is just an example of some of the beautiful rare species that we found. There's one bird in this picture. These habitats, these are not giant open grasslands. These are mostly narrow corridors under power lines that are not going to have like meadowlarks and grasshopper sparrows, but they do have prairie warblers and woodcocks and field sparrows. These are all declining shrubland birds. But the thing to really focus on is the plants and probably the insects. We're not sure yet, but we have some species that are critically imperiled globally. So these are on the edge of extinction that are found in the northern and central Piedmont. We have some that are imperiled globally that are not quite as bad off as the critically imperiled. We have a number that are still somewhat secure globally. They're not about to go extinct off the face of the planet, but they're critically imperiled in Virginia. So we're about to lose them in Virginia. And then we have a bunch that are declining, and that's about as best we can do now in terms of estimating their conservation status. That's for the insects. And I just want to do a profile for a couple of these rare plants so you get a feel for them. And they each have their own interesting story. And so this is Epling's hedge nettle. This plant was first discovered in around 1943 near Thoroughfare Gap in the Bull Run Mountains along Blantyre Road. So it was discovered by Harry Allard. And so we haven't even known that it has existed for very long. It has since been found in a couple other sites in a few other states, but it's not common anywhere, and it's on the edge of extinction. Um, and this site, the type locality where it was first discovered, was recently sold to a new owner. The previous owner wouldn't let us on there to see if the plant was still there, but the new owner did, and we went, and thankfully this fall we found that there's still a nice population of this plant, the Epling's hedge nettle. But we're going to be collecting seeds from it. We're going to be managing the site to try to help it. We might be reestablishing it in another site where it's been lost. This is an example. It's found in wet sites, wet grasslands, and so we think that beavers would have played a role historically in maintaining open wetlands where it would have been found. Torrey's mountain mint is imperiled globally, and its stronghold really seems to be Virginia. So it's found in the surrounding states, but it's only known from like 40 or so sites in the world, and a few of those are in Fauquier County. And then the early false foxglove is a fun one because this plant was until last year it had not been seen since 1993 in Virginia. So the last site where it was seen in 1993 got paved over, and then no one ever saw it again, and we were despairing. And a lot of people had looked, a lot of good botanists have searched for it, professional botanists, not found it. But then Gray Catanzaro last year rediscovered this plant in Prince William County, and it was a huge deal. We are really grateful that Gray found these plants. And so there's a future again for this species in Virginia. So we're working with the folks who manage that site to try to make sure it hangs around. We're also going to probably try to propagate it, although it's a hemiparasite, so it gets some of its nutrients by parasitizing other plants, so it's not that easy to propagate. Prairie warbler, I mentioned that one. It has declined by about almost a quarter in the last 10 years in Virginia, so it's really not doing well, and we find them often in these remnant grasslands. The large thorax snail-eating beetle, kind of a mouthful, but this is a rare ground beetle that hunts snails, and it appears to specialize on grasslands. And I found one night on a remnant grassland nearby. The cowpath tiger beetle, this is a rare tiger beetle that we found at Manassas Battlefield. It has disappeared from most of its former haunts in the southeast, and so this is one that we're really watching. It's also a beauty. The false foxglove mini digger bee is another really rare insect. Drew Cheney found this one, and it is specialized on false foxglove. So like the plant I just showed you, that it has to have those plants. There are other members of that genus, thankfully, that it can survive on, but it has to have pollen from that genus of plants to survive. So these places are threatened by a lot of different factors. The power companies are using herbicide to maintain these power lines. They're spraying the woody plants, and sometimes they spray more than they ought to. Like in the top picture here, they ended up basically killing everything in this power line clearing. And that was a site where a rare plant was found. Also, people just don't know about these places, and that's why I'm excited to be talking to y'all and getting the word out. Because if nobody knows about these places, they're not respected, and so it's the path of least resistance. They put in pipelines. That's what happened at this place near Clevenger's Corner, or this was a fiber optic cable that they put through, and then they planted fescue on top, and they were done. So we've got to get the word out about these places. And thankfully, Dana Milbank, who has a place in Rappahannock County, Washington Post journalist, he wrote a story about these remnant grasslands, and that has helped to raise the profile of them a bit. And we have also, just as of last week, we hired a new staff member at the Clifton Institute. She is our new grassland steward, Heather Pointer, and her job is going to be to work with Dominion and landowners to try to improve the management of these remnant grasslands. This is a picture from back in 2020 when we were meeting with Dominion to talk about some other rare plants that got sprayed in Fairfax County. So we're really hopeful. Now we have a full-time person to be dedicated on this. We are hopeful that we can reverse the degradation of some of these places. Okay, but so that brings me to restoration and what we all can do on our own land to try to bring back some native plants and try to connect up fragmented plant populations. So, it's critical to save the remnants and try to reverse their decline, but we also have a big opportunity with meadow planting. So like this is your typical fescue field. If we convert this to native plants, especially ones that use local seed sources or seedling sources, then we can connect up these fragmented remnant grasslands. So that brings me to the Native Seed Project. So our research on remnant grasslands taught us what the goal is. It would be great to have a field with 100 species of native plants that is similar to one of these remnant prairies. The problem is that it's hard to get the seeds to do that. So a lot of the species we'd like to plant, you can't buy from any seed company. And those that you can buy, they usually have genetics from other states. And so that means they often bloom at the wrong time. And in some cases, they might even be a different species. So we got together with a bunch of partners, and our goal is to launch the native seed industry in Virginia to try to create a source for what we need for restoration projects. And this is just an example of things blooming at the wrong time. So this is ironweed. This is a study from Mount Cuba in Delaware, and they planted a whole bunch of varieties and species and genotypes of ironweed. And on the top, you can see this is July to September. So this is when the plant is blooming. And in the dark purple square, that's when there were a lot of flowers. And then the little circle with the bee, that shows when the ironweed specialist bee was visiting those flowers. And so this is similar to the false foxglove bee. The ironweed, the denticulate longhorn bee, can only survive on the pollen of ironweeds. And so if there are no ironweeds blooming, then those bees are going to die. So that's one plant. That's a second plant. This is all the ironweeds. And you can see that they're blooming at very different times from July until September. And you can see also that several of these species are not supporting the specialist bee. So the specialist bee is pretty much in a 4-week window. And so if it's blooming at the wrong time, you're out of luck. So this is a strong argument for using local species and local genetics in your meadow plantings. We also know from several studies, like this one, this is of switchgrass, and they collected seeds from Texas to Michigan, and then they grew seedlings and they planted seedlings from all the different sites along that gradient from Texas to Michigan. And they found that the local ecotype plants, locally sourced plants did better. So it's not too surprising, but the plants establish better and they live longer. We also now know from another study in Texas that of the wildflowers and grasses, quite a few different species. They did a common garden experiment across Texas, and they found that the local ecotypes do better. And they were actually able to convince the Texas Department of Transportation to pay a premium for the local ecotype seeds because in the long run, they end up saving money by planting local ecotype plants. And there's a lot of demand, so this is probably not a surprise. Like VDOT, for example, is a big potential customer as well as solar farms. But for now, we're focused on meeting the need for local landowners. I think local landowners are going to be our main customer for the first few years of this project, maybe for several years of this project. And there are also no native seed farms in Virginia, so this is a big economic opportunity for farmers, and you don't need a lot of land to grow a significant crop of wildflower seeds. So we're collecting seeds from the wild. We're then growing seedlings in the greenhouse, and we're giving the seedlings to farmers to plant crops of wildflowers and grasses for commercial seed production. And this shows what the field looks like and at harvest time. And yeah, it's a challenging project. It's going to be hard to make money doing this, but we are making progress. Okay, so that brings me to our grassland restoration experiment. And so hope you can bear with me for a little more science, but this is very applied. So I think the results of our grassland restoration experiment are really relevant for people who want to plant a meadow. So you might think, given how common fescue is, that there would be a bunch of studies that have identified the best way to convert fescue to a wildflower meadow. But in fact, there are very few, and there's really only one that I'm aware of that's exactly relevant to what we're doing. And they actually found that a single herbicide spray in the winter was just as effective as planting a seed mix of native seeds. And it was 4 times cheaper as well, not surprisingly. And the idea here is that if you wait and spray herbicide in the winter, you just spray once in the winter, you kill the fescue and orchard grass while they are photosynthesizing and growing, while the native plants are dormant. And by doing that, you kill the fescue and you release the seed bank. The seed bank is the viable seeds that are already in the soil. So that's one potential treatment that we would be interested in testing. And so we had a big field at the Clifton Institute, a 100-acre pasture, and we decided to divide it up into 8 different pieces to try different ways of converting it to native plants. First, we have the control where we did no establishment method, and then we mow half and burn the other half every year to maintain it as a field. Then we have the single spray of herbicide, which was glyphosate in this case in November. Um, so that was replicating what I was just talking about, and sprayed it in the winter, let the native seed bank come up, and then we mow half and we burn the other half just to maintain it as a field. Then we have the spray 3 times and plant method. This is the standard recommendation from NRCS, where you spray herbicide 3 times and you plant cover crops in between. And then finally, you plant a diverse seed mix of perennials, 34 species in our case, of grasses and wildflowers. And finally, we had the organic alternative where we plowed it once and then disked it 6 times to get rid of the native seed, sorry, to get rid of all the weeds that were germinating. And then we ended up planting the same perennial seed mix. And then we burn half and we mow the other half. And we got together with our partners at Virginia Working Landscapes and Virginia Tech and American and Oak Spring and did this, replicated this study at 2 other sites, at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute and at the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. We wanted to know, first of all, how do the plants and soils of fescue fields, those are the baseline experimental plots before we did anything, how do they compare to remnant prairies? Secondly, do fescue fields become more similar to remnants after restoration? Obviously, we hope that they would. Third, which restoration treatment leads to the most improvement? And do fescue fields have useful seed banks? So we did 1 million plant surveys and we dug a lot of holes to get data on soils. And this is what it ended up looking like. So this is 4 years in, and this is where we planted a seed mix. And it looks pretty good. I mean, there's lots of colors here, and it's actually mostly a native plant. It's crownbeard, Verbicina occidentalis, the yellow one. The problem is that there's a lot of crownbeard. This is really probably not the goal for most people when they're putting in a meadow. There's ironweed, that's cool. That's a native one, the purple one. Then there's the blue one, that's chicory, that's not native. So this is, we can already tell, not looking much like a remnant grassland, but it is a big improvement from a fescue pasture. And yeah, when we look at the data, that's what we see. We see that we're only able to establish about 50% native plant cover. And as a reminder, with the remnant prairies, we had 86% native plant cover. So we got a long way to go, but it's definitely progress. And then looking at the data from the Clifton Institute, here on the y-axis is the number of native plant species, and the different boxes are showing different treatments. So the blue is control, the green is a single spray, the orange is a spray and plant, and the burgundy, which you can't see really, is the organic treatment. Then the boxes, the hatched boxes were ones that we burned, and the open boxes are ones that we mowed. And this is 2019 before we did anything, and all the plots are the same. This is what we would expect in terms of native plant species richness. And then we see a surprising thing. We see that the control increased as well as all the other treatments. So everything got better. So just removing the cows and burning or mowing instead of having a bunch of cows on there seemed to help the native plants in the control plots. We also see that the single spray or the spray and leave, the green ones, are no better than the control. So that's not encouraging for trying the single herbicide spray method. And we see that the 2 different methods where we planted this native seed mix were the most effective. That's the spray and seed, the standard NRCS recommendation, and the till and seed, which is the organic alternative. And finally, we see that there's no difference between burning and mowing. Now, in terms of the soils, here we're looking at 3 different nutrients, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And the light green boxes are the fescue fields, whereas the dark green are the remnant prairies. We see, not surprisingly, that the fescue pastures have more nutrients in them. This is from fertilizer, it's from the cows. But we see, and this is also not very surprising that we saw higher pH, so the soil was more basic in the fescue fields compared to the remnant prairies. This is partially because the farmers are putting lime out there to raise the pH, which is better for growing fescue and orchard grass. But then we start to see some surprises, and this is the carbon in the soil. And so we would expect that a really rich plant community, a lot of species, an ancient plant community would have a lot of carbon in the soil, but in fact, we found that the fescue fields have more carbon than the remnant prairies. And even more surprising, we found that there were more soil microbes in the fescue fields than there were in the remnant prairies. And we would really not expect this. If you have a really rich plant community, a lot of different plant species, we would expect a corresponding rich diversity of soil microbes, but we did not see that. And we saw one tiny effect, but overall, we basically saw no effect of the experimental treatments on the soil. And this was only 3 years in, so maybe not too surprising that we didn't see any effect of the experimental treatments on the soil. Okay, now, and this is like the peak of difficulty for this presentation. But you can do it. So this is a principal components analysis. This is a way of looking at a bunch of variables collapsed into two axes. And here we have a bunch of teal triangles. And these are the remnant prairies. And this is based on the soil chemistry. We have 28 different chemical and microbial variables that we studied for the soil. This is a way of looking at all that information. And basically, if the points are close together, that means they have similar soils. Then if we plot these red circles, these are the fescue fields in 2019, before we did anything, before the restoration treatments. We see that they were pretty different from the remnant prairies. There's some overlap. There's some sites that were similar in terms of soil microbes and soil chemistry, but overall, we see a pretty good division between the soils in fescue pastures and the soils in remnant prairies. Now, of course, we would hope that with the restoration treatments, we would see the fescue fields become more similar to the remnants, and we would see these points intermixed in 2023. But in fact, we see basically no change. We see that the remnant prairies are still very distinct from the restored fields. And this is maybe not that surprising now that we've already talked about the microbial results. Now, so why the weird results? Okay, well, this is a soil from the tallgrass prairies. This is over limestone bedrock. It's a really deep, very black, carbon-rich soil. And so, maybe it's not that surprising if we start to think about it. This is a typical Piedmont prairie soil. This is from Clevenger's Corner in Culpeper County. What's left of it. And you can see they're very, very different. You can see there's not as much carbon in that soil. So, with a little more thought, we probably shouldn't have been surprised by that result. The microbes, though, are a surprise. And, right now, the only thing I can come up with is that maybe there's a lot of ruderal species are, more aggressive, disturbance tolerant species that are found in the fescue pastures. And that's why we have more microbial biomass in those compared to the remnant prairies. The other thing to consider is that the remnant prairies in general are on really terrible soil. That's why they're there. So they weren't suitable for agriculture, most of them, and they weren't plowed. And that means they are pretty bad soils. And so maybe we shouldn't expect there to be a thriving community of soil microbes. But clearly we have a lot more work to do here. And now the last research thing I'll talk about is our work on seed banks. And we got together with a high school student, Rachel Harrington, and she collected a bunch of soil samples from the experimental plots before we did anything. So this was in 2019. She then removed the roots from the soil and she sowed the soil into trays and put them in the greenhouse. And by doing this, we found out what was in the seed bank. We wanted to know, was there anything good in those fescue pastures? Is it necessary to plant a seed mix, or can we just rely on the seed bank in the fescue pastures? And these pastures, by the way, had been grazed for probably 100+ years. And secondly, we were curious, if you do a plant survey walking around, does that give you a good idea of what's in the seed bank or not? So we wanted to see if the standing vegetation was similar to what germinated from the soil. So here on the y-axis is the proportion of the samples where that plant species was present. So red clover was the most common plant that germinated from the soil samples, followed by Indian tobacco, black-eyed Susan, fleabane, oxeye daisy, and ragweed. These are not what we were hoping for. So there aren't a lot of desirable, old growth grassland type plants in the seed bank, unfortunately. And then we compare the data on the seedlings that germinated from the soil to the standing vegetation. These are the green bars. We see that the most common plants growing in the field were horse nettle, coralberry, tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass. And we see a big mismatch. And so with the exception of nimblewill, there really wasn't a correlation between the standing vegetation of the field and what germinated from the seed bank. Okay, but so what do we make of all this? Well, the restoration treatments are not turning these plowed fields into remnant prairies. And, we shouldn't have been surprised by that, but it's still a little disappointing, I guess. Um, but they are really improving the situation. So we've gone a long way from a fescue field. Now we have a lot of pollinator habitat at the very least out there. The methods where we planted the seed mix, the perennial seed mix, were the most effective. And the seed bank results back this up. There's not much good in the seed bank, at least at Clifton. I think the soil is too soon to know how the restoration treatments will affect the soils. Um, and we don't see much evidence for fire being useful as a method of converting fescue to natives. So this has also been borne out in other studies. This is a common misconception that you could just burn a field and that'll convert it from fescue to natives. That's not the case. The fescue does open up bare ground, which is critical for quail and native bees. So I just have a couple minutes left. I want to give you a few thoughts on meadow establishment, and then we can open it up for questions. How to get started with the meadow? The first thing to do is to work on your plant identification, and we recommend that folks use iNaturalist for this. Um, so iNaturalist, you take a picture, you upload it, and then you have real humans confirm your observation. That's not the case with most other apps. So this is why we recommend using iNaturalist. Also, vaplanatlas.org is a really important resource. It's free. You can go to that website and you can get a range map for every plant species in Virginia. We're really lucky to have that in our state, and that's really helpful. So we, as a bare minimum, we recommend if you're planting a meadow that you plant species that are native to your county. How to begin? The first step is to let it grow up and see what you've got. Unfortunately, there are some examples of people um, who accidentally sprayed or remnant prairies basically on their land and then replanted them with seed mixes. And most of the seeds are from other states, remember. So you're wasting money, you're getting rid of stuff that can't be planted, and then you're replanting with seeds from other states. So there's a lot of reasons to not do that. You want to be a little patient, let it grow up and see what you've got. And don't be afraid to ask for advice. That's where we can help. That's where NRCS and private lands biologists can help find out what's in your field and help you come up with a plan. But you want to find out if you have a native grassland already, if you have a degraded field, which is a mix of natives and non-natives, or if you have truly a non-native field. So if you're lucky enough to have a mostly native field, you just well, all you need to do is control a few non-natives and you won't need to plant anything. If you have a mix, then like if you have at least 3/4 native plants, then one good option is to do that single herbicide spray in the winter, knock out the non-natives and let the native seed bank express itself. You can do this with clethodim or glyphosate. And the reason it didn't work in our case, the single spray, is because we had very few natives to begin with out there. So what we did was actually unleash the beast. We sprayed the fescue and then a lot of the really bad stuff germinated. So you don't want to mess with that. But if you let it grow up and you really do have all fescue, then you're going to have to be pretty aggressive, either with herbicide or with an organic alternative. Um, the standard treatment is 3 herbicide sprays, planting cover crops in between. And you can do the same with disking or with removing the sod or with putting down black plastic. Those are mainly for smaller sites. But there are some organic alternatives to consider. Yeah, and I don't have time to go over all of this. One thing that you want to consider is stratification or not. So your seeds, a lot of them are going to need a cold, moist period to germinate. So we often recommend planting in the fall to let the seeds do that naturally. And you want to be patient with these meadows. So they're going to look really ugly in the first year, and it's going to be foxtails, it's going to be mare's tail. Mow it high. You can go in with a bush hog, mow it high. Your little perennials are going to be under there and they won't be cut. But otherwise, just be patient. Don't replant it because in a couple of years, it's going to look like this, hopefully. And then we always recommend burning or mowing in February or March. That's the best time to manage a meadow. I think, yeah, I mean, we're coming up on 8 o'clock. I think I might leave it there. And I think Andrea has a couple of closing slides that she'd like to do, and then we can take some questions. But I will say thank you for your attention.
Awesome, Bert. Thank you. All right.
So do I stop? I guess I
I
stop
think
sharing.
you have to stop. Yes. Just bear with us for a second as we, can you all see that? Oh, nope. That is the wrong thing I shared. Well, in the meantime, let me ask you a question. You can talk while I mess with the technology. But is there any hope for under the power lines getting the power company to discontinue herbicides in lieu of an annual mowing to allow the natives that may be there to return?
Well, let's see. Did you mean should they mow instead of spray or should they spray instead of mow?
Should they, well, is there any hope to get them to stop the spraying, like in your
Yeah,
discussions with
we'll
them?
see. We'll see. And we just hired our full-time grassland steward last week, and that's going to be her main job, really. Um, but it's kind of complicated because in some ways, I mean, mowing is not a perfect solution either because if it's wet, it's going to make ruts. And also, it doesn't do a great job of controlling woodies. I mean, really, if you were lucky enough to have one of these sites on your land, I would recommend just doing cut and paint herbicide application. And if you do that, you're not hurting the native plants, and there's nothing for Dominion to spray. So that's really the way to go.
All righty. Second question. Have the U.S. National Park Service, Virginia State Parks, and Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources conducted plant and animal surveys on battlefields and other prairie type open habitats?
They have done some. I don't know about DWR, but definitely National Park Service. And we did some of our sites were at Manassas Battlefield as well.
All right. I want to just add, and by the way, sorry, I'm off camera. I can't, um, that we're hoping to work with more historic sites, and I'm hoping maybe we'll find some remnant prairie on them. Um, so, okay. Is there an alternative product to glyphosate, which is known to be toxic and dangerous to health of soils, wildlife, plants, and water resources?
Yeah, and so I didn't have a lot of time to talk about that, but whenever you're managing grasslands, you're going to be killing something. So when we do the annual bush hog in February or the fire, we're going to be killing something. If you When we did our plowing, that was really destructive. So that didn't use any chemicals, but it destroyed the soil structure. It also really compacted the soil. It brought up the clay to the surface and really compacted the soil. Um, Plowing or any kind of tilling also releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. Putting down black plastic cooks the soil microbes. So it's not a simple calculation when you're trying to decide how to establish or manage a meadow. And glyphosate has a bad reputation, but it's one of the more innocuous, toxic choices that we can make. Um, so yeah, so there's not a silver bullet. But if you really hate glyphosate, there are other herbicides that you can try, but they are also toxic. Um, the good thing about glyphosate is that it doesn't move. So when it hits the soil, it stops. And it also doesn't remain active in the soil, doesn't remain killing stuff for a long time. But clethodim is one if you want to just kill fescue, clethodim is an alternative. Also, you can try one of those organic alternatives.
All righty. And this is a comment, but you might also have, no matter what I do, Johnson grass tends to dominate my property. Any advice for
Yeah,
this gentleman?
that's unfortunate. Yeah, that's really bad. Kadira has been researching that and she could maybe get back to you on that, our landowner outreach person. But yeah, spraying it, mowing it repeatedly over years is probably the way to go. And maybe, oh yeah, Supleo is recommending Blue Ridge Prism. That might be a general recommendation for herbicides. But yeah, Johnson grass is really hard. You can Google it. There's a lot of people who have tried different ways of trying to control Johnson grass. But if we see a field that's dominated by Johnson grass, we encourage people to not plant a meadow there because it's so hard to deal with.
That's sad. Okay. Have you worked with any soils to which biosolids have been applied?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Any other comment on biosolids?
I no comment. I
No
don't know anything
comment.
about them.
Okay.
I've smelled them before. That's it.
Okay. Uh, were the fescue pastures richer both in total biomass of microbes as well as diversity of species than the remnant pastures?
Yes, biomass and diversity, which is really weird.
Hmm. Okay. What was the method for measuring soil microbial activity? Was it a respiration method or were the specific microbes identified?
The PLFA, phospholipid fatty acid analysis is how that was done.
Okay, we're getting some good science questions here.
Yeah.
And sorry to people who aren't quite tracking with all of those. It's okay. Like I don't track with neuroscientists. Uh, where Johnson grass doesn't take over, Lepsidiza does. Any recommendations for eliminating without killing the native plants?
Yeah, I think Chinese Lespedeza is probably the biggest problem that we're dealing with in certainly in planted meadows, but also in some of the remnants. And the problem with Chinese Lespedeza is that it likes all the same conditions that the native plants like. It likes fire. Fire really helps it germinate. And it likes acidic soils. So yeah, unfortunately, and also you can't pull it. So there is no organic alternative for Chinese Lespedeza. So yeah, I think the one property I know that has eliminated it at scale, sprayed it with Triclopyr 3, and there was definitely collateral damage. I mean, this is foliar spraying. But by getting rid of it, the native plants came back in, and it ended up being a positive, definitely a positive thing to do. And that's what we're going to be trying at Clifton. And it's just the kind of thing where you hold your nose and you're killing some good stuff. Um, but in the long run, like if we don't do that at Clifton, there's a couple of fields that are right now that are really special and really rich that are going to be completely overwhelmed by Chinese Lespedeza.
Okay. I was surprised that the plants, organic materials, and the remnant sandstone fields didn't create soil over time. Maybe I misunderstood.
Wait,
Any?
what's that?
So I was surprised that the plants, the organic materials in the remnant sandstone fields didn't create soil over time. This is a comment from,
I don't quite understand that, but I think they would have.
okay. By the way, if you want to rephrase it, Noreen, I think we're not tracking with that question quite. Okay, have you seen some relative stability in this established grasslands without frequent mowing or burning? Is selective woody plant control viable?
So is does that mean I take it to mean that if you use herbicide to control the woodies and do nothing else, what happens to the grassland? And in effect, that's what Dominion is doing over most of the state. And it's unclear what's going to happen when we do that, because really these systems are adapted to fire and grazing. And so if you never remove the biomass, what's going to happen to these plant communities? Are we going to maintain the really high species richness? Are we going to maintain the rare plants? I don't know. And that it's an interesting question. But I think it seems to be emerging that the best practice is to do dormant season fires. If you have a nice field or you do a dormant season fire like in February or March, and then you use herbicide to control the woodies, and no mowing. That seems to be probably the best practice. Um, and another alternative is doing a growing season fire or fire in the summer. That'll help you control the woodies. But there are other problems with that, like killing box turtles and pollinators and stuff. And also just getting the right conditions to get a growing season fire to go is a challenge.
Okay. Can we find the results of your plot study on your website?
We are working on publishing a paper on this. It's not done yet. I think unfortunately, right now the best resource would be like a recording of this talk. We don't have like a fancy report or anything. We have a manuscript that we're going to send to a journal maybe in like a year. Yeah.
Okay. And I'll just break in there and say that we are going to be sending out the recording. So you can watch this again and hopefully get some answers. Okay. How small is too small for a meadow restoration?
Yeah, nothing is too small. Um, I started with a pickaxe, and this area was like 5 feet by 5 feet or something like that. And I just removed the sod and planted my first meadow. And it's still going, 10 years later, and pollinators use it. So yeah.
That's awesome. Okay. The last question, and then I have a quick question for you. If a landowner farmer is interested in the native seed network, can they be directed to Clifton Institute? Are y'all seeking participants?
We are, especially in the coastal plain around King and Queen County, but also in our neighborhood here. Um, we are interested in more farmers. We're also interested in volunteers to help us collect seeds. And yeah, if you go to our website, we have a page for the Native Seed Project, and you can get in touch with our Native Seed Project coordinator on there. Or if you email any of us, we can also put you in touch with her.
Okay, well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I want to ask you this. We like to talk about being realistic, which is, as humans trying to do the best we can with the
Yeah.
knowledge that we have and the land that we have. Um, could you just end with some comments on, because throughout, first of all, I've heard you say, you don't know a lot, right? We're investigating, we're trying to find out, number one. And I hear you saying, it was still good. The pollinators are coming back. So maybe it's not the perfect seed mix. But could you just kind of opine a bit, a kind of philosophical, like the the realistic part of it, like depending on where you're starting from, which for some of us might be not much knowledge at all.
Yep, sure. Yeah, and I don't want to come off as like a purist, like only save the remnant prairies and like not worry about anything else. I think any kind of project where you're trying to convert a non-native field into some natives is going to be positive. And the more local that you are, the better. And so that's why we're trying to create these sources of local ecotype seeds. If you're doing a small project, you can get your plants from Earth Sangha or from us or from some of the Hill House Nursery's plants are local ecotype. We are going to be selling limited quantities of seeds, local ecotype seeds at our plant sale in May as well. But if you don't have access to local ecotype seeds, and Ernst, by the way, the Ernst Seed Company, they sell now about 10 species that have Virginia genetics as well. So, one option is that you can just like buy those 10 species and you plant a relatively simplistic meadow with those. Um, but what most people do, and we work with a lot of landowners who do this, is that they pick a seed mix, usually with our help, that is species that are native to their county that matches a remnant prairie pretty well in terms of its composition, but they have genetics from other states, and so maybe they bloom at the wrong time or they're too tall or whatever. But it's still as best as we can do right now. I mean, it's certainly not like we're going to all throw up our hands and wait 10 years until we get the local ecotype seeds. We have to act now. And so we are very practical and we try to give advice so that people can, make the most of what we can do nowadays.
Awesome. Well, Bert, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm really looking forward to partnering with you and with Dominion and with everybody trying to do better by the wildlife and our remnant native prairies.